Hello, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to look at the Italian with bishop e7. That is after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3, and now bishop e7. Black can also start with bishop e7. We'll look at that in the third move sidelines. But basically, knight f6 first is the more accurate move order. Bishop e7 first is played to avoid knight g5, but after knight f6, I don't recommend knight g5. Which is a whole different ball game. After d5, ed5, there are lots of complications, and I believe it's covered in other courses, and I felt this doesn't really fit in well with the approach for my course. I wanted not to go for early tactical skirmishes in the center. I wanted to build up the center slowly, play d3 here, and eventually make headway in the center later. It's a little bit more fundamental, a little bit less of an all-in approach early on. Bishop e7. Bishop c5 is the main option, and it's covered in many previous chapters where I look at the Italian with bishop c5 in great detail. The second most popular approach is to bring the bishop out to e7. Alternatively, black also can try to fianchetto the bishop to the king side with h6, followed by g5 or followed by g6, and for that we have also a separate chapter. So here we look at bishop e7 only. This is decent, very healthy. Black wants to castle, finish his development with d6, and then choose his plan later on. It is a little bit passive. The bishop on c5 is much more active. There is no need to keep the bishop this close to the back rank. So I believe it has its ups and downs. Let's look at the lines. After a short castle, black can start with d6 or castle. Castling first is the more normal move order, but d6 first is also quite tricky. Our setup will involve bringing the knight out to c3 and the pawn to a4, but we have to take care of the move order as early as here. If black starts with d6, we do want to play our a pawn to a4, allowing our bishop to retreat to a2. If we started with knight c3, we'd have to deal with knight a5, which is very unfortunate. Therefore, after a4 castle, knight c3, we are back in business, and same after 5 castle, we start with knight c3 here. Here, we don't play a4 because black can play d5. And after knight c3, there is no knight a5, as the e5 pawn is still hanging. So only after d6 do we have to go, go a4. If castle knight c3 and now h6, h6 is okay. But it has no independent value. We can play a4 here, and after d6, it transposes to d6, a4, h6. There is no real option, alternative to d6 that makes much sense. So d6, now a4. By the way, I should mention that instead of knight c3, the main line is rook e1, also stopping d5, and after d6, then a4. And also there is a variation with knight c3, d6, and a3, which is what I played. I sort of combined these two into knight c3, a4 system, which I believe is very, very principled. And I had my reasons why I chose this. I believe it to be very, very critical. And there are some small nuances on why I prefer knight c3 over rook e1, as we will see. Black has lots of different plans here. There are really different approaches. There is bishop g4 intending knight d4. There is bishop to e6 immediately or after perhaps h6. There is also knight a5, bishop a2, c5. Let's see if I forgot something. Yeah, I cover bishop e6, bishop g4, knight a5, a5 as well, and h6. a5 is also a sort of a useful move, grabbing some space on the queen side and intending bishop e6 later on. Let's look at them one by one. Bishop e6 first. Speak a little bit more before we look at bishop e6 about the concept and our development concept and the reasoning behind it. Since the bishop is not on c5 here, we play the knight on c3. Our knight is often heading towards d5, where it will trade the other knight, and then we'll play c3. controlling the d4 square. And the reason why we do plays knight on c3 as early as here is that with bishop not being on c5, the move knight d4 becomes much less attractive. So while we can play knight d5 and recapture with the bishop, if black plays knight d4, he has to recapture with the pawn, creating this weak doubled pawns. So this is why against systems with bishop not being on c5, as you will see also against systems with bishop being on g7, I do recommend knight c3. So I think fundamentally the difference between the control over d5 and d4 squares are really, the difference is there due to the fact that our bishop is on c4 and he's as locked in on e7. So I hope I made that clear, and that's why also bishop e6 makes sense if you think about it. Now if we trade here, which is possible, this d5 square is under black's control, and so our knight on c3 becomes misplaced. That said, we can play knight e2, route the knight to g3, then bring the pawn to c3, and we do that in some of the variations, but here after bishop e6, it's stronger to play knight d5. Bishop d5, if not bishop takes d5, we go c3 next, guard these squares, perhaps expand later on the queen side with b4. Bishop d5 is more principled, ed knight b4. This is a thematic reaction. Our d5 pawn now under attack, but we follow up always with d4. If black takes on d5, we take on e5, knight b d5, d, knight e5, and the central pawns have been traded. Our position is very open, symmetrical, but we have the bishop pair, and this gives us a small stable plus. If e d4, black wins a pawn, but we have lots of compensation. We take knight d4, knight b d5, bishop d5, knight d5, and knight f5. Knight is a great piece here on f5, and after c6 we also got this thematic rook lift with rook a3. A very, very nice idea, bringing the rook across, and black cannot make use of his extra pawn, and very often, as we will see, let's say after bishop f6, and for example c4 already, he is going to lose his d6 pawn. So this pawn deficit does not play much role. In fact, this rook h3 is a very dangerous idea after bishop f6 as well. Just rook h3, I believe, was very dangerous. So e d4, a little too optimistic. e4 is the most principled. And here we have two options. The simple knight d2 and knight g5. Let's look at knight g5. Very interesting move. Now, the point is, if black now plays c6, dc, bc, c3, knight bd5, with the knight on d2, we have that position. We cannot play f3 because of knight e3, but here we can play f3. That's very nice. We open the position for our bishops, and black's knights don't have any good outposts. Note that if you play rook e1, and that is also a thing with the knight on d2, black has this strong move knight c7, and we cannot recapture on e4 because of d5. After knight g5, black can play h6 too. And here we go c3. Of course, we don't want to retreat the knight. hg, cb, we get a very strange position with lots of doubled pawns here, doubled there, doubled as well. Very, very messy, very hard to evaluate. Knight h7, a very strong move, ready to reinforce the e4 pawn with f5. Now rook e1, similar is rook a3 right away, f5, and now g4. Rook a3 first also was an option, I believe, but g4 is the move, and we really want to open the files. Rook wants to swing across to h3, f3 will come, opening the e file as well. We have quite some upsides here, potentially lots of open files for the rooks, and some outposts like rook on e6 is going to be monstrous. At the same time, our bishops, it is questionable. In particular, the c4 bishop, I do wonder how good a piece it is. So staring currently at the d5 pawn, excuse me. So I was not sure if this should be my main recommendation, but it's certainly something to look into. Instead, I recommend as a main move the simple 11 knight d2, c6. If knight bd5, knight e4, we just have a small edge thanks to the bishop pair. So c6, dc, bc, c3, knight bd5. Now again, rook e1, there is knight c7. This theme is always there. So I propose bishop takes d5. Also possible queen c2, but again, knight c7 is there, and this position is perhaps you can play f3, and this position is a position. But I recommend taking. Black has to recapture, and now we can try to play against this weak d5 pawn. Rook e1, the knight is heading towards e3. black will try to push the f pawn forward. Knight e8 is sensible. Knight f1, f5. Knight e3 hitting the d5 pawn. Knight c7, and now a thematic reaction against f5. An important move to remember, f4. Of course, we want to stop black from expanding. If he gets to push these pawns, it's going to be very nasty. So we go f4. We stop the expansion. And now the knight on e3 is beautiful. It's a perfect blocker, perfect blockader. And you would think that we play on the queen side with b4 because that's where we have the pawn majority. But in fact, I think we do want to play b4 and rook a2. But then rook f1 and g4 is also a very nice idea. The knight on e3 is this kind of blocker that supports the g4 and f5 pushes later on. And this is a typical pawn structure, which I believe can backfire for black real badly. So finally, I like this knight d2 move. And I believe bishop e6, knight d5 works very, very well. Bishop g4, very principled as well. We go h3, we grab the bishop. If bishop h5, now bishop e3 is good. We want to stop knight d4, obviously. We will just recapture and play knight d5 if that happens. And if king h8, perhaps hoping to push the f-pawn at some point, we go knight d5, bishop d5, and f5 doesn't really work. The bishop is going to reconnect with the knight, and we have the g4 idea. I think without the f6 knight, we're happy to go for g4. We have to be very careful with g4 before that. Black could sack and then have this nasty pin with f5 coming up. It was his idea, but we have this knight d5, and after the trade, g4 is coming. The bishop on h5 will be out of play, and it's very important in these structures to realize that bishop on h5 or potentially g6, it is sort of stranded on the right side of the board, and our bishop on d5 becomes a dominant piece, and black cannot challenge it on the light squares in the center. So realistically, black should take on f3. After h3, takes a knight d4. This idea, by the way, has been played by Dubov against the a3 system, which is very similar but slightly different. I prefer to grab more space, but this knight d4 idea he's played here against a4. Yeah, I decided to see what happens if he does the same. Knight d4, queen d1, c6. Bishop a2, just stepping out of d5 just in case. Maybe preparing f4. Knight e6, stopping f4. d5 is not very good. After edcd, bishop g5, these pawns are targets. d5 pawn is simply falling. So knight e6, bishop e3. Good square for the bishop. If d5, edcd, d4 once again. Fix that d5 pawn, weakness. So I'll look at a5, just trying to grab some space on the queen side. Queen f3. We want to mobilize stopping d5 for now. Queen d7, rook a1. It's important to not forget to bring that a1 rook into the game. I believe it's one of the many mistakes weaker and less experienced players make, but a very, very common one. I notice very often that players above beginners, even strong amateurs or even club players, they know all the rules, they follow all the opening rules, they don't move the same piece too many times, they bring stuff to the center, but they do forget to bring that a1 rook into the game before they start attacking. And very often you see that when you start attacking, at the end of the day, that one rook on the left side of the board is lacking in your attack, and more often than not, it's important to bring that rook into the game. So rook a1 here, rook e8, black does the same, and now knight e2. We can let d5 happen, just knight g3. The pawn here is of not much value on d5. If d4 opens the diagonal, if d4, then what was the whole fuss about? We just take back. So black is left here without a clear plan, while we want to bring the knight to f5. We really enjoy our a2 bishop, which is unopposed, as black gave up light square bishop. Also, knight h5 is an idea to weaken control over the d5 square, since the knight on f6 contributes to that. So trading it is not a bad idea as well. I believe a pleasant position for white here. That's for bishop g4. Knight a5, bishop a2 c5 is very typical. Now there are two ways essentially of playing these positions. So black took d4 square under tremendous control, but weakened d5 square even further. We can move the knight to d5, then play c3, control the d4 and b4 squares, but we can also play bishop g5, then take it, and then install a knight on d5, which is a bit more double-edged, but even more ambitious as we gain further control over the d5 square. For example, knight c6, bishop f6. It's rare, in fact, in not that rare, but it is in many cases a mistake many amateurs make of just giving up the bishop without it being attacked by h6. But this is one of the few cases where we should do so voluntarily. The reason is we don't have that many useful moves left. Black has many more, like rook b8, a6, b5 is useful. Also bishop e6 simply is very useful. So we don't have much in return for that. Our plan is really to bring a knight to d5, then go c3 perhaps before. And we can only do that once our knight is on d5. So we cannot play c3 already here. So that's why we should take knight d5. And that's why we would really like black to play h6 here. That would be really nice. But okay, he shouldn't. Knight 6, take, knight d5. g6, intending bishop g7, a very common reaction. And now I propose a small positional trap, queen d2. c3 is perfect, normal move, intending b4. Basically what happens a lot in these positions is we trade the knight for the knight, bishop for the bishop, something like bishop e6, knight e7 eventually, or bishop e6 before, cb knight before. And after we trade these two pairs of pieces, we'll be left with the knight on f3 versus a bishop on f6. The bishop is pretty bad. So we see that a lot. But in this particular position, I propose this queen d2 move, a little trap, hoping for bishop g7, which is very, very likely. Hard not to make this natural move. And now queen g5. A really nice idea to trade queens. Once again, when we trade queens, we think, how does this affect the position? And the main question to ask, I believe, is whose king is safer after the trade? Or let's say whose king was more in danger. And surprisingly, it is not that white's king was in danger, but it is that in the long run, black's main and perhaps the only real source of counterplay is the kingside push with f5 and then perhaps f4, g5, g4, like in King's Indian, or something along these lines on the king side, while we are enjoying the central d5 square and some play on the queen side. So although there is no danger to the king just yet, in the long run, in a potential struggle, in the middle game, black's only source of counterplay is likely going to be a desperate attack against our king. And so we are happy to trade the queens off in advance. And without the queens, the f5 push really loses its punch. Knight d4 is something we are really happy to see. We can just trade on d8. Black can play knight f3 intermediate, gf, and rook d8. And he's doubled our f pawns, but it's so unimportant compared to the other factor, which is the knight on d5. And we have now complete dominance over the d5 square. The bishop is pretty bad. Even if it goes to h6, which it should, it's still going to be shooting into empty air. While we will start our play here on the queen side, a5, followed by rook fb1 and b4. Just a fantastic position for black, and he cannot really exploit these weaknesses. They're more of an aesthetic nature. There is nothing concrete about them. Black can't really set up counterplay along the f-file. Just a very poor position for black. So nice little positional trap there. If black doesn't go for bishop g7, we can just play c3 before and enjoy our play on the queen side. That is knight a5. 7a5 is it's a little bit of an abstract move, just taking back some space on the queen side. I propose rook e1. It's a useful move. Now after bishop e6, knight d5, bishop d5, ed knight before, we have d4. And after e4, knight d2, rook is well placed on e1. Again c6. And here, I should say, if not c6, we just recapture knight b5, knight e4, of course. And likewise, if after d4, knight b5, we had seen these positions, we just take on e5, knight e5, slightly better because of the bishop pair. So it's e4 and c6, and dc is met by bc, and then c3, d5. The complications appear to be fine for black. Instead, we play c3. It's a brilliant positional sacrifice. If knight b5, of course, knight e4, we're just slightly better because of the bishop pair. After something like knight e4, rook e4. And after cd5, we just go bishop f1. And this is beautiful. Knight a6, this is even the better move, because knight e6 is the most natural. Then simply f3 is extremely bad. But even after knight a6, white is still much better with f3, ef, queen f3. And this is a remarkable position. We are a pawn down, but we have just an excellent piece play. We control all the important squares, really. Knight on c7 is better placed than on c6. That's why knight a6 is a better move. But still, we play bishop to d3, bring this knight across from f1 to g3 or e3. This bishop will be developed. The d5 pawn is so incredibly weak fundamentally, as the d file is blocked by the d6 pawn. d5 pawn is sort of waiting to eventually be captured. It's just doomed to be captured. Imagine black's only hope would have been to bring the knight to e4 and support it with f5. Then he would be doing very well, but this is just not feasible. It's never happening. That's why we bring the bishop to d3 before rerouting the knight. So yeah, this is a fascinating position where white has a tremendous positional advantage. And in fact, I believe if you are to get this position, your opponent will play knight c6 without understanding much. This is more normal looking square, but here it's even worse. After f3, ef, queen f3. Knight on c6 is very badly placed. It's dominated by these two pawns. It has no squares to go to. So nice little positional pawn sec that I've discovered here. 8h6, h3 inclusion is also possible. Bishop e6, knight d5, bishop d5, ed, knight b4, d4. Same thing. e4, we again do the same thing. Knight d2, c6, c3, cd, bishop f1. There's no real difference in having included h3, h6. And after h6, h3, it was possible to play rook e8. Very solid. Black wants to drop the bishop back to f8, play bishop e6. Very, very, very solid, very passive, but certainly possible. Now I recommend d4. Note that it's only working here because we have prepared an antidote to bishop g4 in form of h3, and now we are guarded from bishop g4 and are really ready to push in the center with d4. We have prevented all the counterplay ideas. If e d4, knight d4, we have a bit more space. This position is reminiscent of the Philidor pawn structure. That's the e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, e d4, knight d4. So you've got a chapter on this whole business separately. This position is a decent version of that, but still white has a little bit more space. Let's come back here. We've got a pawn here, a knight here, and after bishop f8, bishop f4, white has a very natural and smooth development. More space in the center, very, very good control over the good protection of the e4 pawn. And in Melkumian Becerra 2019, white managed to win after knight e5, bishop b3. A little more to the point is probably to trade, as black lacks space. Knight d4, queen d4, bishop e6. But after rook a1, white is just slightly more pleasant. The bishop is more active than its black counterpart, and we've got a small advantage. Certainly a possible way to play for black, but nothing to be excited about. Finally, 7h6. This is actually very clever. Now, if we play h3 here, which is very tempting, black goes bishop e6. Now, after knight d5, bishop d5, ed, knight b4. And this stuff doesn't work anymore as well, because after d4, e4, knight d2, c6, the inclusion is just in black's favor down the line. And that's why I think we should be more clever here than that. Note that after a5, rook e1, h6, h3, we still have bishop e6, knight d5, because we've got this d4, knight d2, c6, c3. But without rook e1, a5 is different, because we don't have c3 here, because knight b d5, and then knight drops back and d5 comes. So, and likewise this dc bc, c3, knight d5, bishop d5, cd stuff it works much less good with the pawn on h3 and pawn on h6, because later when we go for this f4 position, these squares will be weak. And so that's why after 7h6 we have to be more clever. And I propose a prophylactic move, a bishop d2. Bishop d2, a very clever move. Very subtle move as well. The idea is that after bishop e6, knight d5, there is no longer takes, and knight b4. I believe this works quite well. If knight a5, we go bishop a2 back, c5. Now this is a very nice little trap. Having included h6, bishop d2, black allowed knight h4, going for knight g6, and the variations here are very pretty. If knight e4, bishop h4, typical operation. Now this works very well for white. Queen h5. We go for kingside attack with f4 and bishop takes h6. Black should always be very careful with this knight e4 tactical operation. Here it just doesn't work at all for him. After king h7, addressing knight g6, the lines are also very pretty. We go f4, ef4, and now we have to realize that g5 is coming after capture on f4, but we go for rook f4, and if g5, rook f6, bishop f6, and queen h5. And a beautiful positional exchange sacrifice. We've got nothing concrete. We just have a long-term light square control and just a tremendous attack. g5, h6 are weaknesses. Queen on h5 is sitting very well. Rook f1 coming, knight f5, following up. Knight d5 is also coming. The attack just goes by itself. Rook f1, knight f5, knight d5, and then mate will find itself. So knight e5, c5, surprisingly bad here. A nice little trap as well. Bishop e6, knight d5. Now bishop d5 ed is just not good. Without knight b4, there is no point in giving up the bishop. So better is to play after knight d5, perhaps rook e8. And here we have a small plus. I propose a5. You could also go for rook e1. Let's say a5. Knight b8. Not an easy move, but a very clever one. Black hints at knight takes d5 now. After ed, there is no longer a fork. So I propose to take on f6, bishop f6, bishop e6, rook e6. As the rook is on e8, you don't want to open the f file. So rook e6, and now just c4. And we have a better bishop. The pawns are placed, our pawns on c4, d3, e4 are placed on the light squares. This bishop is staring into its own dark pawns. A little more space on the queen side, a little more comfortable on the king side with g3, king g2. Just a small advantage, similar to, it reminds me in some sense of the Italian with bishop c5 in this a6, bishop a7, bishop e6 lines. I'll show you now quickly what I mean. In these positions that are covered in the other chapter in this course. Similar in nature. And here too, we often trade lots of pieces, and sometimes we go for this b5. Sorry, in the long run, not right now, of course. In the long run, we go for this b5 c4 binds, and it's a little bit similar here as before. B5 will happen. Just a small pleasant advantage. With that, I believe we have covered the bishop e7 system. So knight c3, a4 setup, again very important in the opening. After d6, for example, not to fall for knight c3, knight a5, to go a4 first. And after castle, knight c3, now d6 to play a4. We have looked at bishop g4, knight a5, bishop e6, all the relevant setups. And with that, I'd like to conclude this video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next chapter.